My uncle shoved me into the wedding cake at my own reception, humiliating me in front of 200 guests. But when my fiancé stepped forward and said, "Touch my colonel again, please do," my uncle's face went white. And by the end of the night, family secrets that had been buried for decades came spilling out in front of everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Adrienne, and what started as the happiest day of my life turned into the moment I discovered my entire family had been lying to me about who I really was. But before we dive into how one shove at a wedding unraveled 28 years of deception, I need to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment because your stories matter to me, and I have a feeling some of you might relate to what happened next. The morning of my wedding in Millfield Springs started like a fairy tale. I woke up in the bridal suite of the historic Rosewood Manor, sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the gardens where Jasper and I would exchange vows in just 6 hours. My dress, a vintage-inspired gown with delicate lace sleeves, hung on the antique armoire like something out of a dream. Jasper had been deployed for 8 months before the wedding. He was a colonel in the Army's special operations, though most of my family didn't really understand what that meant beyond he's in the military. They saw his quiet confidence and assumed he was just another soldier. They had no idea what kind of man I was marrying. My family had always treated me like the delicate one, the one who needed protecting, the one who couldn't handle herself. My uncle Roderick especially had this way of speaking to me like I was still 12 years old, patting my head and making decisions for me without asking. "Little Adrienne needs someone to look after her," he'd say, usually while discussing my life as if I wasn't in the room. Growing up, Uncle Roderick was the self-appointed patriarch of our family after my father passed away when I was 10. He controlled family gatherings, made financial decisions for my grandmother's estate, and had this way of inserting himself into every major moment of my life. When I got into college, he questioned my choice of major. When I got my job at the environmental consulting firm, he suggested I find something more suitable for a young lady. And when I introduced Jasper to the family 18 months ago, Roderick immediately started making jokes about military men and their wandering eyes. But Jasper never rose to the bait. He'd just smile politely, call my uncle sir, and change the subject. I thought he was being respectful. I didn't realize he was being strategic. The ceremony itself was perfect. Jasper looked incredible in his dress blues, standing at the altar with perfect military posture as I walked down the aisle. His eyes never left mine, and when he said his vows, promising to protect, honor, and stand by me through everything, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The reception was held in the manor's ballroom, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables draped in ivory linens. Everything was exactly as I dreamed it would be. The first dance, the toasts from our friends, the way Jasper's hand never left the small of my back as we moved through the room greeting guests. But then came the cake cutting. The 3-tier vanilla cake with buttercream roses sat on a lace-covered table in the center of the room, surrounded by guests with their phones ready to capture the moment. Jasper stood beside me, his hand covering mine on the silver cake knife, both of us laughing at something his best man had just shouted from the crowd. That's when Uncle Roderick approached. He'd been drinking, I could smell the whiskey on his breath from 3 feet away, and he had that look in his eyes that I learned to recognize over the years. That mixture of condescension and irritation that appeared whenever he felt I wasn't following his unspoken rules about how I should behave. "Adrienne, sweetheart," he said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "don't you think you're being a little dramatic with all this pomp and circumstance? I mean, we all know how these military marriages turn out." I felt Jasper tense beside me, but his expression remained perfectly calm. "It's a beautiful celebration, sir," he said evenly. Roderick laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, come on, Colonel. You don't have to pretend with us. We're family. We know Adrienne has always been a dreamer, making everything into a bigger production than it needs to be." Heat rushed to my cheeks. This was my wedding day, in front of all our friends and family, and he was doing what he always did, making me feel small. "Uncle Roderick, Please, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. This is supposed to be a happy moment. Happy? He stepped closer, and I could see the angry glint in his eyes that had always made me want to disappear. You want to know what would make me happy? If you'd stop acting like you're something special just because you managed to land yourself a military man.
The room had gone quiet around us. I was vaguely aware of guests turning to stare, of conversations stopping mid-sentence, of my mother's horrified gasp from somewhere behind me. "You've always thought you were better than the rest of us," Roderick continued, his voice getting louder. "Ever since you were a little girl, acting like you deserved more than what this family could give you. Well, let me tell you something, princess." And that's when he reached out and shoved me. Not gently, not playfully, hard enough that I stumbled backward, lost my balance in my wedding dress and heels, and went crashing directly into my beautiful 3-tier cake. Buttercream and vanilla sponge exploded everywhere, frosting in my hair, on my dress, sliding down the lace sleeves I'd spent months choosing. The cake table collapsed under my weight, sending flowers and decorations scattering across the floor. For a moment, the ballroom was completely silent, except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I sat there in the wreckage of my wedding cake, frosting dripping from my veil, staring up at my uncle's satisfied smirk, and felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, my last thread of patience with being treated like I didn't matter. But before I could say a word, before I could even begin to process what had just happened, Jasper stepped forward. His voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something in it that made the hair on my arms stand up. Something dangerous. "Touch my colonel again," he said, looking directly at my Uncle Roderick. "Please do." And suddenly, my uncle's face wasn't smirking anymore. It had gone completely white. Because, apparently, there were things about my new husband and about my own family that I was about to learn the hard way. The preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The silence in the Rosewood Manor ballroom was deafening. Crystal chandeliers that had been casting romantic golden light just moments before now seemed to spotlight the disaster unfolding in the center of the room. 200 guests sat frozen at their ivory-draped tables, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, forks suspended over half-eaten salmon, all eyes locked on the scene before them. I could smell the vanilla buttercream mixed with the scent of crushed roses from the centerpieces that had scattered when the cake table collapsed. My grandmother's pearl necklace, something old for the wedding, was now sticky with frosting, and I could feel cake fillings squishing between my fingers as I tried to push myself up from the wreckage. The ballroom's polished marble floor, which had been perfect for our first dance just an hour earlier, was now a minefield of cake debris and broken china. Pieces of the antique cake server, a family heirloom from Jasper's grandmother, lay scattered around me like tiny silver daggers catching the light. But it wasn't the mess that made my stomach drop. It was the way every single person in that room was looking at me, not with concern or sympathy, but with that particular kind of horrified fascination people get when they witness a car accident, like I was entertainment. My bridesmaids, Chloe and Rebecca, stood frozen by the head table in their sage green dresses, hands pressed to their mouths. My mother, Delphine, had gone completely white, one hand clutched to her chest like she was having heart palpitations. Even the wedding photographer had lowered his camera, apparently too shocked to capture what was happening. Uncle Roderick stood over me, swaying slightly from the whiskey, his face flushed and satisfied like he'd just accomplished something important. His wife, Aunt Priscilla, was tugging at his arm, whispering frantically in his ear, but he shrugged her off. Behind him, I could see my cousins, Trevor and Maxine, exchanging uncomfortable glances, probably wondering if they should intervene or pretend they didn't see anything. The wedding band had stopped mid-song, their instruments hanging silent in their hands. Even the catering staff had paused in the doorway, silver trays balanced in their arms, unsure whether to continue serving or evacuate. But the most unsettling thing in that moment was my new husband. Jasper hadn't moved an inch from where he'd been standing beside me. He was still in perfect military posture, shoulders back, hands at his sides, expression completely neutral. But there was something different about him now, something that made the air in the room feel electric and dangerous. In the 18 months we'd been together, I'd seen Jasper handle difficult situations with grace. Rude customers when we went out to dinner, aggressive drivers in traffic, even hostile locals during his deployment stories. He always stayed calm, always de-escalated, always took the diplomatic approach. This was different. His jaw was set in a way I'd never seen before, and his eyes, usually warm brown like coffee with cream, had gone completely cold. Not angry exactly, but calculating, like he was running through options in his head, and none of them were pleasant for Uncle Roderick. When Jasper spoke, his voice carried across the silent ballroom with perfect clarity. Military projection, I realized. The kind of voice that could command attention across a battlefield. "He touched my colonel again," he said, each word precisely articulated. "Please do." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees.
Uncle Roderick's satisfied smirk faltered. The flush in his cheeks faded to a sickly pale color, and I watched his hand, the one that had just shoved me, begin to tremble slightly. "Now wait just a minute," Roderick started, but his voice came out as more of a croak than the commanding boom he'd been using all evening. Jasper took a single step forward. Just one. But somehow that small movement transformed the entire dynamic of the room. Suddenly, my uncle, who had seemed so large and intimidating moments before, looked small and fragile in comparison. "I'm sorry," Jasper said, his voice still perfectly controlled. "Did I stutter?" The wedding guests were starting to lean forward in their chairs now, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Whispered conversations began to ripple through the room like water. "Who is this guy? I thought he was just in the army. Did you see Roderick's face? What did he mean by colonel?" My mother appeared beside me, finally breaking free from her shock to help me stand. Her hands were shaking as she brushed cake crumbs from my veil, and I could hear her muttering under her breath. Prayers, maybe? Or curse words. With my mother, it was often hard to tell the difference. "Adrienne, honey, are you hurt?" she whispered, but her eyes kept darting between Jasper and Roderick like she was watching a tennis match where the stakes were life and death. I opened my mouth to say I was fine, but the words wouldn't come, because I was starting to realize that I wasn't fine. Not because of the fall, or the ruined dress, or the humiliation in front of all our guests. I wasn't fine because I was looking at my new husband, the man I'd just promised to spend the rest of my life with, and seeing a complete stranger. The Jasper I knew would have helped me up first, checked if I was okay, maybe made a joke to lighten the mood. The Jasper I knew would have been diplomatic with my drunk uncle, found a way to de-escalate the situation without causing a scene. This version of Jasper was still standing perfectly still, watching Uncle Roderick with the kind of focused attention a predator gives its prey. And my uncle, who had never backed down from a confrontation in his life, was starting to sweat despite the air conditioning. The strangest part was the way other people in the room were reacting. Jasper's military friends, the ones who'd flown in for the wedding, had all straightened in their chairs. Not like they were preparing to break up a fight, but like they were waiting for orders. And in the back corner of the ballroom, I noticed someone I hadn't seen before, a man in a dark suit who definitely wasn't on our guest list, speaking quietly into what looked like a radio or phone. "Jasper," I said softly, finally finding my voice. "It's okay, I'm fine." He turned to look at me then, and for just a moment, I saw a flash of the man I'd married. Concern, love, protectiveness. But then his gaze shifted back to Uncle Roderick, and the stranger returned. "No, Adrienne," he said, his voice still carrying that edge I'd never heard before. "It's really not okay." And that's when I realized that my wedding day was about to become something much more complicated than a family embarrassment. That's when I realized that maybe I didn't know my husband as well as I thought I did. And that's when Uncle Roderick, looking like he'd just seen a ghost, said something that changed everything. "You didn't tell her, did you? You didn't tell her, did you?" Uncle Roderick's words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The way he said it, not angry anymore, but almost pitying, made every nerve in my body go on high alert. Tell me what? I asked, looking between my uncle and my husband, cake frosting still dripping from my hair onto the marble floor. Jasper's jaw tightened, and for the first time since I'd known him, he wouldn't meet my eyes. Roderick, don't. Don't what? My uncle's voice was getting stronger now, like he'd found his footing again. Don't tell your new wife who she really married. Don't mention that the sweet little army colonel she thinks she knows has a nickname that makes grown men cross the street. The wedding guests were completely silent now, but I could feel their attention like a physical weight. My mother's grip on my arm tightened, and I could hear her muttering under her breath, prayers maybe, or curse words. With my mother, it was often hard to tell the difference. What nickname? I demanded, turning to face Jasper fully. What is he talking about? Jasper finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but regret. Deep, painful regret. Adrienne, we can discuss this later. The ghost, Uncle Roderick interrupted, his voice carrying across the ballroom like he was announcing the winner of an award. They call him the ghost. Ask him why, Adrienne. Ask your new husband why they call him the ghost. I felt the blood drain from my face. I'd heard that nickname before, whispered in news reports about classified military operations, mentioned in documentaries about special forces that Jasper always changed the channel away from. But I'd never connected it to him. That's not... I started, then stopped. Because looking at Jasper's face, I could see it was true. You're the ghost? He nodded once, barely a movement.
The ghost wasn't just any soldier. The ghost was a legend, a myth, the kind of operative other military personnel talked about in hushed tones. The man who could eliminate targets without anyone knowing he'd been there. The one who'd single-handedly taken out an entire terrorist cell in Afghanistan without firing a shot. The one whose real name was classified at levels most people didn't even know existed. And I'd married him without knowing any of it. How long? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Adrienne, how long have you been lying to me about who you are? The question came out sharper than I intended, but I was past caring about my tone. I was standing in my ruined wedding dress, covered in cake, finding out that my husband of exactly 3 hours had been living a completely different life than the one I thought I knew. I never lied to you, Jasper said quietly. I told you I was special operations. I told you my work was classified. I told you there were things I couldn't discuss. You told me you did logistics. The words exploded out of me, louder than I meant them to be. You said you managed supply chains and coordinated with local forces. You made it sound like you were a glorified accountant with a security clearance. Because that's what you needed to hear, he said, and there it was, the truth I'd been refusing to see. Because you wanted to marry a man who had a normal job, who could give you a normal life, not someone whose work involves killing people, Uncle Roderick finished helpfully. Your husband kills people for a living, Adrienne. That's what ghosts do. They make problems disappear. I stared at Jasper, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to laugh and explain that my uncle was wrong, that he'd misunderstood, that there was some reasonable explanation for all of this. But he didn't deny it. He just stood there, still in perfect military posture, watching me like he was calculating how much damage this conversation was going to do to our marriage. Is that true? I asked. Another tiny nod. The ballroom started to feel like it was spinning. All those nights when he'd come home from deployments, quiet and distant, needing space to decompress. All those times he'd wake up in the middle of the night and sit by the window for hours, just staring out at nothing. All those moments when I'd catch him watching crowds in restaurants or checking exits before we sat down. I thought it was just normal military hypervigilance. I thought he was being cautious. But it wasn't caution. It was habit. The habits of someone who'd spent years hunting human beings. How many? Adrienne! How many people have you killed? He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, I saw something that looked like pain. I can't answer that question. Can't? Or won't. Both. I felt like I was going to be sick. Not because of what he'd done. I understood that soldiers sometimes had to kill in war, but because he'd hidden it from me. Because he'd let me fall in love with a version of him that didn't exist. "You lied to me," I said again, and this time my voice broke on the words. "I protected you," he countered, "from information you didn't need to have, from a world you shouldn't have to think about. That wasn't your choice to make." The words echoed in the silent ballroom, and I realized that every single one of our wedding guests, had just heard me scream at my new husband about his secret career as a government assassin. My mother made a small whimpering sound beside me. Somewhere in the crowd, I heard my grandmother's voice saying "Sweet Jesus" over and over like a prayer. But I barely registered any of it, because I was too busy staring at the man I'd married and realizing I had no idea who he really was. "What else?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet now. "What else have you been lying about?" "I never lied. What else don't I know about my own husband?" Jasper glanced around the room, clearly aware that we had an audience of 200 people, then back at me. "Adrienne, this isn't the time or place." "No," I said, cutting him off. "This is exactly the time and place, because apparently I just married a complete stranger in front of all these people, and I think they deserve to know the truth as much as I do." Uncle Roderick was watching the exchange with obvious satisfaction, like he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. But there was something else in his expression now, something that looked almost like nervousness. "Tell her about the house," he said suddenly. I turned to stare at him. "What house?" "The house you think you're going to live in after your honeymoon, the one in your name. Tell her about that, ghost." Jasper went completely still, and I felt that cold feeling in my stomach spread to my chest. "What about our house?" I asked. We'd bought a beautiful colonial in Millbrook Heights 6 months ago. It had taken all of our combined savings plus a loan from the Veterans Administration, but we'd finally found the perfect place to start our married life. The deed was in both our names. I'd picked out every piece of furniture. I'd spent weeks planning the garden.
"Jasper," I said when he didn't answer, "what about our house?" He looked like a man facing a firing squad. It's not exactly what you think it is." "What do you mean it's not what I think it is?" "It's a safe house," Uncle Roderick said when Jasper hesitated. "Military property, part of his cover. She doesn't actually own anything, does she, Ghost? Just another prop in your little charade." The ballroom started spinning again, faster this time. The house, our house, the place where I'd imagined raising children and hosting Christmas dinners and growing old together, wasn't real. It was just another lie. "How long?" I asked again, but this time the question encompassed everything: the job, the house, probably our entire relationship. "Adrienne, how long have you been pretending to be someone you're not?" And that's when Jasper said the words that shattered what was left of my fairy tale wedding day. "Since the day I met you." Since the day I met you? Those 6 words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, my heel catching on a piece of broken china from the cake disaster. Since the day he met me, which meant our first conversation at the coffee shop on 5th Street when he'd accidentally bumped into me and helped me pick up my scattered environmental impact reports, had been orchestrated. The way he'd seemed so interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about sustainable development, that had been an act. Our first date at the botanical gardens, where he'd known exactly which paths to take and which flowers I'd love most, he'd researched me. Everything had been a lie. But as the reality of those words settled in, something else started clicking into place. Memories I'd dismissed, moments that had seemed odd but not significant enough to question. Now they were arranging themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces, forming a picture I didn't want to see. "The coffee shop," I said, my voice hollow. "You didn't bump into me by accident." His silence was answer enough. "You knew I went there every Tuesday morning for my meetings with the Henderson account. You knew because you'd been watching me."
The ballroom wedding guests were leaning forward now, no longer pretending to look away. This was better than any reality show they had ever seen. My humiliation was their entertainment. "How long were you watching me before you made contact?" I demanded. "Adrienne, please, not here." "How long?" He closed his eyes briefly. 3 weeks. 3 weeks! He'd been stalking me for 3 weeks, learning my patterns, my preferences, my vulnerabilities, before he'd engineered our meet-cute at Morningside Coffee. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why me? But even as I asked the question, more memories were surfacing. Strange things that had never made sense before but were becoming crystal clear now. The way he'd known exactly which neighborhood I lived in before I'd given him my address, claiming he'd guessed from my favorite restaurants. The way he'd had keys made for his apartment after only 2 weeks of dating, saying he trusted his instincts about people. The way he'd encouraged me to quit my job at the environmental firm and take the position at the Millfield Springs Community Foundation, a job that seemed too good to be true at the time. "Oh my God," I breathed, the realization hitting me like ice water. "The foundation job! You got me that job!" I could see from his expression that I was right. The community foundation isn't a real nonprofit, is it? It's a front. Some kind of government operation? "It does real work," Jasper said quickly. "The environmental projects are legitimate. The community outreach programs help real people. You've made a genuine difference. But it's controlled by your people, by whatever agency you work for." He nodded reluctantly. The job I'd been so proud of, the work I thought was making a real impact on our community, it had all been part of keeping me contained, keeping me busy with projects that felt meaningful while they watched me. But why? Why would a legendary military operative need to create an elaborate fake relationship with a small-town environmental consultant? That's when Uncle Roderick cleared his throat, and I remembered he was still there, still watching this disaster unfold with obvious satisfaction. "Tell her about her father." My blood turned to ice in my veins. "What about my father?" My father, David Whitmore, had died in a car accident when I was 10. A drunk driver had hit his vehicle on Highway 47 during a thunderstorm. It had been tragic, senseless, but ultimately just a terrible accident. "Jasper," I said, turning to face my husband, "what does my father have to do with any of this?" But I could already see the answer in his face, that same regretful expression, that same reluctance to meet my eyes. "Your father wasn't killed by a drunk driver," Uncle Roderick said when Jasper remained silent. "He was eliminated, terminated, assassinated, whatever word you want to use for murder." The ballroom started to tilt sideways. I reached out blindly and found my mother's arm, gripping it to steady myself. "That's not true," I said automatically. "Dad died in an accident. There was an investigation. The other driver was arrested." "The other driver was a patsy," Roderick continued, his voice gaining strength as he watched my world crumble. "A convenient drunk with a criminal record who was paid to take the blame. Your father was killed because he discovered something he wasn't supposed to know." "Stop," I whispered. "He was working on a story, something big, something that would have exposed a government program that certain people wanted to keep buried." "Stop it!" "Your father was a journalist, Adrienne, a real one, not the environmental blogger you've been told he was. He worked for the Washington Herald, and he was investigating a classified military operation when they decided he'd become a liability." I turned to stare at my mother, waiting for her to deny it, to tell Uncle Roderick he was lying, to explain that this was all some kind of sick joke. But her face had gone completely white, and she was avoiding my eyes. "Mom?" I said. She didn't answer. "Mom, tell me he's lying." "I can't," she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear her. The pieces were still clicking together, but now they were forming a picture so horrific I wanted to reject it entirely. My father hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered, and somehow that connected to Jasper, to our fake relationship, to the elaborate construction of my entire adult life. "You knew," I said, staring at my husband. You knew who killed my father? Adrienne, you knew because you work for them, the same people who had him killed. Jasper's silence was confirmation. And you, what, married me out of guilt? Some kind of twisted penance for your colleagues murdering my father? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? I screamed, and this time I didn't care that 200 people were watching. What was it like, Jasper? Did you draw the short straw? Did they assign you to babysit the dead journalist's daughter? Make sure she didn't get too curious about what really happened to Daddy. The wedding guests were completely silent now that I was beyond caring about their comfort or their opinions. I was beyond caring about anything except getting answers to questions I'd never known I needed to ask. The environmental work, I continued, the final pieces falling into place. The community foundation, the sustainable development projects, it was all designed to keep me distracted, keep me focused on safe, harmless causes, while you people made sure I never looked too closely at what happened 18 years ago. Your work matters, Jasper said desperately. You've helped people. You've made a difference. Don't you dare, I snarled. Don't you dare try to make this about my work when everything has been a lie. I looked around the ballroom at all the faces staring at me with mixtures of horror and fascination. My bridesmaids, my cousins, my grandmother, all the friends and family members who'd come to celebrate what they thought was the happiest day of my life. Did any of you know? I asked, my voice carrying across the room. Did anyone else know that my entire life has been orchestrated by government spooks trying to cover up my father's murder? The silence was deafening. But then my grandmother, my sweet, elderly grandmother who'd raised flowers and baked cookies and taught me to knit, spoke up in her soft, papery voice. "We were told it was for your own protection, dear." I stared at her, feeling like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. What did you just say? After your father died, she continued, looking suddenly very old and very tired, they came to us. They said there were dangerous people who might try to hurt you if they thought you knew anything about his work. They said the best way to keep you safe was to let you live a normal life. They? I whispered. She glanced at Jasper, then back at me. His people. The ones who've been watching over you all these years. All these years. Not just since I'd met Jasper, since I was 10 years old. How many of you? I asked, turning back to my husband. How many people have been assigned to my life? But I already knew the answer, didn't I? It was there in the faces around me, in the uncomfortable glances and the sudden inability to meet my eyes. My teacher in high school, who'd encouraged me to pursue environmental science instead of journalism, my college advisor, who'd steered me away from investigative courses, my first boss, who'd recommended me for the foundation job. Even some of my friends, people I thought I'd met organically, people I trusted. Everyone, I breathed. Everyone in my life works for you. And that's when Uncle Roderick smiled, really smiled, for the first time all evening. Not everyone, sweetheart, not me. Not everyone, sweetheart, not me. Uncle Roderick's words hit me like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. In a room full of people who'd been lying to me for years, decades, he was the only one telling me the truth. That's why they hate me. That's why your precious handlers have spent years trying to discredit me, making me look like the drunk uncle, the family embarrassment, because I am the only one who wouldn't play along with their little charade.
I stared at him. Everything I thought I knew about my family dynamics shifting into a completely new configuration. All those years of my mother warning me that Uncle Roderick was difficult, that he had problems with authority, that I shouldn't listen to his conspiracy theories. All those family gatherings where he'd seemed increasingly isolated, where conversations would stop when he entered a room. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew about all of this." "I've been trying to tell you for 18 years, he said, and for the first time in my life, I heard pain in his voice instead of anger. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family dinner where they'd change the subject when I tried to bring up your father's real work.
They made me look crazy, Adrienne. They made me look like the unstable one, so you wouldn't listen when I tried to warn you. I thought about all those times he'd pulled me aside at family events, trying to tell me stories about my father that didn't match what everyone else had said. How he'd insist that Dad had been working on something big before he died. How the car accident had been too convenient. How my mother would always interrupt, sending me away to help in the kitchen or check on grandmother, dismissing Uncle Roderick's words as the ramblings of a man who couldn't accept a tragic accident. The night before your engagement party, Roderick continued, I tried one more time. I called you, remember? I said I needed to talk to you about something important, something about your father. I did remember. He'd sounded different that night, urgent, almost desperate. But I'd been busy with wedding preparations, and when he'd started talking about government cover-ups and dangerous people, I dismissed it as another one of his conspiracy theories and cut the conversation short. I told you not to marry him, Roderick said, nodding toward Jasper. I told you there was something wrong with the whole situation. A man like that, showing up out of nowhere, sweeping you off your feet with a perfect romance, it was too convenient, too clean. Why didn't you tell me the truth then? I demanded. Why didn't you just explain about Dad? Because I didn't have proof, he said simply. Not the kind of proof you'd believe. They're very good at what they do, Adrienne. They've had 18 years to perfect their story, to bury the evidence, to discredit anyone who might threaten their narrative. But you have proof now? Uncle Roderick reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. I've been gathering evidence for years. Documents, photographs, financial records. Every piece I could find that proves your father was murdered and that your life has been controlled ever since. I stared at the flash drive like it was a bomb. Part of me wanted to grab it immediately, to finally learn the truth about my father. But another part of me, the part that had been living in a carefully constructed lie for so long, was terrified of what I might find. What kind of documents? I asked. Bank records showing payments from shell companies to everyone who's been placed in your life, medical records that prove the drunk driver who supposedly killed your father was actually in a psychiatric facility the night of the accident, classified communications about something called Project Songbird, a long-term surveillance operation with you as the primary subject. Project Songbird. Even the name sounded ominous. But the most damning evidence, Roderick continued, is in your father's own files, the story he was working on when they killed him. You have Dad's files? Copies, hidden in a dozen different locations. Your father was smarter than they gave him credit for. He knew he was in danger, so he made sure his research would survive even if he didn't. I could hear Jasper shifting behind me, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't look at him right now. Couldn't bear to see his face while Uncle Roderick was dismantling the last 18 years of my life. What was he investigating? A network of military contractors who were using government resources for private assassinations. Politicians, journalists, activists, anyone who threatened their interests. They were operating under the cover of classified anti-terrorism operations, but really, they were just hired killers with government backing. My legs felt weak. I reached for a nearby chair and sat down heavily, not caring that my wedding dress was still covered in cake frosting. Dad found out about the network? More than that, he'd identified 3 specific contracts, including the names of the targets and the operatives assigned to eliminate them. He was planning to publish everything. And they killed him to stop the story? They killed him to protect their operation. But they made a mistake. They didn't realize he'd hidden copies of everything, and they didn't anticipate that his brother might spend the next 18 years trying to piece together what really happened. I looked around the ballroom at all the faces staring at us. My mother, my grandmother, my bridesmaids, the wedding guests who'd come to celebrate what they thought was a happy occasion. How many of them had known? How many had been complicit in the lie? Mom? I said, turning to face Delphine. Did you know Dad was investigating this network? She didn't answer, but I could see the truth in her eyes. Did you know they were going to kill him? No, she said quickly. I knew his work was dangerous, but I never imagined they would actually.
But you knew afterward. You knew it wasn't an accident. She nodded reluctantly. They came to me the day after the funeral, men in suits with government badges. They said there were people who might try to hurt you if they thought you knew about David's work. They said the only way to keep you safe was to let everyone believe he'd died in an accident. And you agreed to lie to me for 18 years? To protect you, she said desperately. Everything we did was to protect you. By taking away my choice? By building my entire life on a foundation of lies? By keeping you alive, Jasper said quietly, speaking for the first time since Uncle Roderick had started his revelations. I turned to look at my husband, if that's what he really was, and saw something I'd never seen before. Not the confident military officer, not the gentle man I'd fallen in love with, but someone who looked genuinely tormented. The network your father was investigating, they're still active, still eliminating threats. The only reason you've lived to see your 28th birthday is because they believe you're contained, controlled, unaware of what your father discovered. And what happens when they find out I know the truth? The silence that followed my question was answer enough. That's why you married me, I said, understanding flooding through me like poison. Not guilt about my father, not orders from your superiors. You married me because you knew Uncle Roderick was getting close to the truth, and you needed a way to monitor the situation more closely. It started that way, Jasper admitted. But Adrienne, I need you to understand, what developed between us, what I feel for you, that's real. Nothing about this is real, I said, standing up from the chair. Nothing. I walked over to Uncle Roderick and held out my hand. Give me the flash drive. He hesitated. Are you sure? Once you see what's on there, you can't go back to not knowing. Your life as you've known it is over either way. I thought about that. About the comfortable illusion I'd been living in for so long. About the safe, predictable existence that had been carefully crafted to keep me distracted and compliant. About the man I'd married, thinking I knew who he was. My life was over the day they killed my father. I just didn't know it yet. Uncle Roderick handed me the flash drive, and I closed my fingers around it like it was a weapon. What's on here? I asked. Everything, he said. Your father's complete investigation. Financial records proving payments to your handlers, communication logs showing how extensively you've been monitored, and most importantly, a list of everyone involved in the network, including some names that will shock you. I looked at the small device in my palm. Such a tiny thing to contain the destruction of everything I'd believed about my life. There's a laptop in my car. We could leave right now, go somewhere private, and I could show you everything. Adrienne, Jasper said urgently, if you walk out of here with him, if you start digging into this, you'll be putting yourself in serious danger. These people don't hesitate to eliminate threats. Like my father? Yes. Then they already see me as a threat, don't they? The moment Uncle Roderick started talking in front of 200 witnesses, I became a liability. Jasper's expression confirmed what I already knew. There was no going back now, no returning to the safe, controlled life they'd built for me. The moment I learned the truth, I'd become as dangerous to them as my father had been. So the question isn't whether I'm safe, I continued, looking directly at my husband. The question is whether I'm going to die ignorant or informed. And with that, I turned my back on my wedding, my ruined dress, and the man I thought I loved, and walked toward the ballroom doors with Uncle Roderick beside me. It was time to learn who my father really was and what he'd died trying to expose. Uncle Roderick's car was parked in the back lot of the manor, away from the main entrance where most of the wedding guests had arrived. As we walked across the gravel in silence, I could hear the distant sounds of confusion drifting from the ballroom, voices raised in heated discussion, chairs scraping across marble floors, the general chaos of a formal event that had devolved into a family nightmare. They'll try to stop us, Roderick said as he unlocked his sedan, a modest gray Honda that looked nothing like the vehicle I would have expected a conspiracy theorist to drive. Jasper's people, I mean. They can't let you leave with this information. As if summoned by his words, I heard footsteps on gravel behind us. I turned to see Jasper striding across the parking lot, still in his dress blues but with his military composure cracking around the edges. Behind him came 3 men I recognized as his groomsmen. But now I was seeing them with new eyes. They moved with the same controlled precision as Jasper, the same alert scanning of their surroundings, the same positioning that kept escape routes clear.
They weren't his college friends. They were his team. "Adrienne, stop," Jasper called out, his voice carrying that command authority I'd heard in the ballroom. "You don't understand what you're getting into." "I understand that you've been lying to me since the day we met," I called back, not slowing my pace toward the car. "I understand that you married me under false pretenses to monitor me for the same people who murdered my father." "It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me," I said, whirling around to face him. "Right here, right now. No more lies, no more half-truths, no more classified information excuses. Tell me the truth about everything." Jasper stopped about 10 feet away from me, his team fanning out slightly behind him. It wasn't an obvious threatening formation, but Uncle Roderick noticed it too because I heard him mutter something under his breath about tactical positioning. "The truth is complicated," Jasper said carefully. "Try me." He glanced at his men, then back at me. "Your father's investigation threatened a counter-terrorism operation that has saved thousands of lives. The network he was planning to expose, yes, they eliminated targets, but those targets were high-level terrorists, arms dealers, people who were planning attacks on American soil. So you're saying he deserved to die?" "I'm saying the situation wasn't as black and white as Roderick wants you to believe." Uncle Roderick snorted from beside me. "There it is, the sanitized version they've probably rehearsed 100 times. Tell her about the senator they killed, Ghost. Tell her about the environmental activist who got too close to their illegal weapons testing. Tell her about the federal judge who was asking too many questions about their funding sources." Jasper's jaw tightened. "Those operations were authorized. By whom? Who authorized the murder of a federal judge?" "You don't have the security clearance to know that information." "I don't have the security clearance to know who ordered my father's execution either, but here we are." We stared at each other across the parking lot, and I could see the moment he made his decision. His posture shifted slightly, his hands moving to a more ready position, and his team took a half step closer. "I can't let you leave with that flash drive," he said quietly. "Can't or won't?" "Both." Uncle Roderick moved closer to me, his hand reaching into his jacket. "Adrienne, get in the car now." "What's in your jacket?" one of Jasper's men asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Insurance," Roderick replied, pulling out what looked like a small recording device. "I've been transmitting everything we've discussed tonight to multiple secure locations. If anything happens to us, if we disappear or have accidents, copies of David Whitmore's investigation go live on every major news network in the country." The tension in the parking lot ratcheted up another notch. Jasper's team was clearly calculating odds, assessing threats, preparing for multiple scenarios. But I could see uncertainty in Jasper's face for the first time all evening. "You're bluffing," he said. "Am I?" Uncle Roderick smiled grimly. "Want to test that theory? Kill us both right here in the parking lot of a wedding reception and see what happens to your precious network when the Washington Post publishes David Whitmore's complete files tomorrow morning. Even if that's true, releasing that information will get people killed. Good people, operatives who are deep undercover, sources who are providing vital intelligence. People like the sources who helped my father identify your assassination targets, the ones who mysteriously died in accidents and suicides after he was eliminated." Jasper's silence was confirmation. "How many people have you killed to protect this operation?" I asked. "That's not a question I can answer." "Can't or won't?" Does it matter? It matters to me. It matters because I need to know exactly who I married. I need to know if the man who tells me he loves me has blood on his hands. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across Jasper's face. Everyone in this line of work has blood on their hands, Adrienne. The question is whether it was justified. And you think killing journalists and judges and environmental activists is justified? I think preventing terrorist attacks that would kill thousands of innocent people is justified. I think stopping arms dealers who sell weapons to groups that target schools and hospitals is justified. I think eliminating threats to national security, even when those threats come from well-meaning people who don't understand the full picture, is justified. Like my father. Like my father. The words hung in the air between us like a physical barrier. He wasn't denying it anymore. He wasn't pretending the network was something other than what it was. "Did you kill him yourself?" I asked. "No. But you know who did." "Yes. And you've worked with them. You've taken orders from the same people who murdered my father." "Yes." I felt something break inside me. Not my heart, because that had shattered hours ago, but something deeper. The last thread of hope that maybe there was some explanation, some justification that would make this bearable. And you married me knowing all of that.
"I married you because I love you," he said, and for the first time his voice cracked. "Because somewhere in the middle of this assignment, you stopped being a target to monitor and became the most important person in my world. But you were still reporting on me. Still feeding information about my life, my thoughts, my plans to the people who killed my father? Yes, even on our wedding day." He closed his eyes briefly. "Especially on our wedding day." That admission hit me like a physical blow. Our wedding day, what I'd thought was the beginning of our real life together, had been just another day of surveillance for him. "What did you report?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That you were stable, contained, that you suspected nothing about your father's real work or the circumstances of his death, that you were focused on environmental causes and community development, that you posed no threat to ongoing operations." And if I had posed a threat? The question hung in the air for a long moment before Jasper answered. Then my orders would have been different. Uncle Roderick made a sound of disgust beside me. "Tell her what those orders would have been, Ghost. Tell her what happens to threats in your line of work." But I already knew. I could see it in Jasper's face, in the way his team was positioned and the careful calculation behind his words. "You would have killed me," I said. "It wouldn't have come to that. But if it had, if I'd gotten too close to the truth, if I'd started asking the wrong questions, if I'd become too much of a liability, you would have eliminated me just like you eliminated my father. Adrienne, answer the question." He looked me in the eyes, and I saw the man I'd fallen in love with warring with the operative he'd always been. "If you had posed a genuine threat to national security, then yes, those would have been my orders." The parking lot went completely silent. Even Uncle Roderick seemed stunned by the brutal honesty of the admission. I stared at my husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, who'd held me when I cried about my father's death, who'd made love to me just last night while knowing that he worked for the people who'd murdered the most important man in my life. "And now?" I asked. "Now that I know the truth, now that I'm definitely a threat to your operations, what are your orders now?" Jasper's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket, and I saw Uncle Roderick tense beside me. "My orders," Jasper said carefully, "are to contain the situation by any means necessary, including killing your own wife, if necessary." And that's when I realized that the man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future and my life, was preparing to murder me in a parking lot to protect the same people who'd killed my father. "Get in the car, Adrienne, now."
Uncle Roderick's voice was sharp with urgency as his hand moved to something else in his jacket, something that made Jasper's entire team shift into combat-ready positions. But I was frozen, staring at my husband across 10 feet of gravel, processing the fact that he was prepared to kill me to protect his mission. The fairy tale was completely dead now, replaced by a nightmare where the prince was actually the dragon. "Get in the car," Roderick shouted, grabbing my arm. That broke my paralysis. I dove into the passenger seat just as Uncle Roderick gunned the engine and threw the car in reverse. Through the rear window, I saw Jasper and his team scatter, reaching for weapons, but we were already speeding towards the manor's main entrance. "Where are we going?" I asked, my hand shaking as I tried to buckle my seatbelt. "Somewhere safe, somewhere with internet access and multiple witnesses." He took a sharp turn onto the main road, because in about 30 minutes, your husband's people are going to realize that staying quiet isn't an option anymore. "What do you mean?" "I mean that recording device wasn't just transmitting to news outlets. It was broadcasting live to a private server that automatically uploads to social media if the stream gets cut unexpectedly." He glanced at me with grim satisfaction. "Every word of what just happened in that parking lot is already online." My stomach dropped. "Online? What do you mean online?" "I mean, anyone with an internet connection can currently watch your military husband threaten to murder you to cover up a government assassination program." He took another turn, this one towards downtown Millfield Springs. "I told you I had insurance." The magnitude of what he'd done hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about exposing the truth to a few journalists. This was about exposing it to everyone, everywhere, all at once. "Uncle Roderick, what have you done?" "What needed to be done. These people have controlled your life for 18 years because they operated in shadows. Well, now they're in the light." My phone started buzzing, then buzzing more insistently. I pulled it out to see dozens of notifications flooding in. Missed calls, text messages, social media alerts. The numbers were climbing rapidly. "Oh my God," I whispered, scrolling through the notifications. Friends from college were texting me in confusion. Coworkers were sending shocked messages. People I barely knew were tagging me in posts asking if the videos were real. The hashtag wedding conspiracy was already trending. "How many people are watching this?" I asked.
Last I checked, about 50,000 and climbing fast. Turns out people are very interested in government assassination programs and fake marriages. We pulled into the parking lot of the Millfield Springs Public Library, a sturdy brick building that stayed open late on weekends. Uncle Roderick had chosen well. It was public, well-lit, full of witnesses, and had multiple exits. "Why here?" I asked as we hurried up the front steps, my wedding dress trailing behind me like a ridiculous white flag of surrender. "Because libraries are sacred spaces in this country. Even Black Ops programs think twice before starting shootouts in libraries. Plus, they have computers, security cameras, and librarians who notice everything." Inside, the weekend evening crowd looked up in surprise as we entered. A woman in a destroyed wedding dress covered in cake frosting, accompanied by a man in a rumpled suit carrying a laptop bag. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair, raised an eyebrow, but simply pointed toward the computer terminals. "Thank you," Uncle Roderick said politely, leading me to a corner workstation where we'd have a clear view of all the entrances. He opened his laptop and pulled up the streaming site. The viewer count was now over 100,000 and climbing rapidly. The chat feed was scrolling so fast I could barely read individual comments, but the general sentiment was clear: shock, outrage, and demands for more information. "This is insane," I breathed, watching the numbers climb. "People are actually watching our family destroy itself in real time." "And that's exactly what's going to save your life," Uncle Roderick said, inserting the flash drive into his laptop. "Because now that this many people know the truth, making you disappear would only confirm everything we've revealed." The flash drive loaded,
revealing folders upon folders of documents. Uncle Roderick opened one labeled Network Operations, and suddenly my father's investigation was spread across the screen in meticulous detail. Names, dates, locations, payment records, assassination targets, operational code names. It was all there, documented with the thoroughness of a journalist who knew his life depended on getting the story right. My father really found all this? I asked, scanning through files that detailed murders spanning over a decade. David was brilliant. He didn't just stumble onto this network, he systematically infiltrated it. He had sources inside military intelligence, contractors who'd grown disgusted with what they were being asked to do, even family members of targets who'd started connecting dots. I clicked on a file labeled Target, Senator Patricia Marsh, the environmental advocate who died in a suspicious car accident 3 years ago while investigating illegal weapons testing. The file contained proof that her death had been orchestrated by the same network that killed my father. She was going to expose military contractors who were dumping chemical weapons in protected waterways, I read aloud. They made it look like she fell asleep at the wheel. Keep reading, Uncle Roderick said grimly. I scrolled down and found the operational details, the contractor assigned to the elimination, the method used to cause the accident, and the cover-up that followed, and the name of the operative who supervised the entire operation. Colonel J. Morrison, call sign Ghost. My blood turned to ice. Jasper supervised the murder of Senator Marsh 3 years ago, 2 years before he met you. I stared at the screen, trying to process the information. Jasper hadn't just worked for the people who killed my father. He had personally overseen the murder of other people who'd gotten too close to the truth. How many? I whispered. Uncle Roderick clicked through more files. According to your father's research, at least 12 confirmed eliminations with Ghost as supervising operative, probably more that David didn't uncover. 12 people. 12 human beings who died because they'd asked inconvenient questions or threatened inconvenient operations. And I'd married the man responsible for their deaths. The environmental activist in Oregon, the federal prosecutor in Miami, the investigative journalist in Phoenix. Each name was accompanied by detailed files showing how they'd been eliminated and how their deaths had been covered up. Jasper killed them all. Or ordered their deaths, which amounts to the same thing. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from my mother. Don't answer that, Uncle Roderick warned. They're going to try to get you back, convince you this is all a misunderstanding. But I was already looking at the missed call notifications, dozens of them from numbers I didn't recognize. The stream was now approaching 200,000 viewers, and apparently some of them had figured out how to find my contact information. This is getting out of control, I said, watching the viewer count continue to climb. Good. Out of control is exactly where we want it, because now that this many people know the truth, making you disappear would only confirm everything we've revealed. As if summoned by his words, 3 black SUVs pulled into the library parking lot with military precision. Uncle Roderick tensed beside me. They found us. How? Doesn't matter. What matters is that they can't do anything dramatic with this many people watching. He gestured to the laptop screen, where the viewer count had just passed 300,000. Through the library's front windows, I could see men in dark suits getting out of the SUVs. They moved with the same controlled precision as Jasper's team, but these weren't wedding guests. These were professionals, and they looked like they meant business. What do we do? I asked. We stay here, stay visible, and keep the stream running. As long as people are watching, as long as your story is being told in real time, they can't make us disappear. The men approached the library entrance, and I recognized the lead figure. It wasn't Jasper. It was someone older, more authoritative. Someone who carried himself like he was used to giving orders that determined who lived and who died. Who is that? I asked. Uncle Roderick looked at the screen, then at the approaching figures, and his face went pale. That's Director Samuel Blackthorne, head of the network's operations division. The man who ordered my father's death? Among others.
Director Blackthorne pushed through the library's front doors like he owned the place. The librarian started to ask if she could help him, but something in his expression made her step back without a word. He walked directly to our computer terminal, ignoring the other patrons who were starting to stare and whisper. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that made entire rooms go silent. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, using my married name like it was a weapon, "I think it's time we had a conversation." I looked at him, this man who had ordered my father's execution, who had orchestrated 18 years of lies, who had assigned my husband to monitor and manipulate me, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not fear, not anger, but a cold, crystalline rage that seemed to sharpen everything around me. "I think you're right," I said, making sure my voice was loud enough to carry to the streaming microphone. The viewer count hit 400,000 people, and Director Blackthorne's carefully controlled expression flickered with something that might have been concern. The conversation he'd wanted to have in private was about to become the most public confession in the history of government cover-ups. Director Blackthorne stood beside our computer terminal like a statue carved from granite and bad intentions. The library had gone completely quiet, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clicking of keyboards. Even the children in the picture book section had stopped talking, sensing that something significant was happening in the corner, where the woman in the destroyed wedding dress was facing down the man in the expensive suit. "Mrs. Morrison," he repeated, and I could see him calculating angles, assessing threats, trying to figure out how to contain a situation that had already spiraled far beyond anyone's control. Perhaps we could discuss this matter somewhere more private. "There is no privacy anymore," I said, gesturing to the laptop screen where the viewer count had just crossed 500,000 people. "Thanks to your network's brilliant decision to threaten me in a parking lot while being live-streamed, the entire world is now watching this conversation." Uncle Roderick had positioned the laptop so that both Director Blackthorne and I were clearly visible in the camera frame. The chat feed was exploding with comments from viewers who were trying to process what they were seeing. A government official confronting a bride in a public library, while hundreds of thousands of people watched in real time. "This is highly irregular," Blackthorne said, his voice still controlled but with an edge of frustration. "Matters of national security cannot be discussed in such a public forum." "National security?" I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is that what you call murdering journalists and environmental activists? National security? You don't understand the complexities of the threats we face. I understand that you killed my father because he was about to expose your assassination network. I understand that you've been controlling my life for 18 years to make sure I never learn the truth. And I understand that you assigned your best operative to marry me so he could monitor me more effectively." The library patrons were starting to gather closer, drawn by the drama unfolding in their quiet weekend sanctuary. The librarian had abandoned any pretense of working and was openly staring at our confrontation. A teenager in the corner had pulled out his phone and was clearly recording everything from a different angle. "What I don't understand," I continued, my voice getting stronger as I saw Blackthorne's composure starting to crack, "is how you thought you could get away with it forever. Did you really think no one would ever ask questions? Did you think you could control every aspect of my life until I died of old age, none of the wiser?" "The program was designed to protect you," Blackthorne said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Your father's investigation put you at risk. There are dangerous people who would have used you to get to information he gathered. Everything we did was to keep you safe. By lying to me every day for 18 years?
By giving you a normal life, a safe life, a fake
life, I corrected, built on the graves of everyone who got too close to the truth. Uncle Roderick leaned closer to the microphone. Tell her about Senator Patricia Marsh, Director. Tell her about federal prosecutor James Hendricks. Tell her about Dr. Linda Yates, the environmental scientist who discovered your illegal weapons testing sites. Blackthorn's jaw tightened. Those individuals interfered with classified operations vital to national security. Those individuals were murdered by your network, I said, looking directly into the camera so that 500,000 viewers could see the truth in my eyes. And my husband, the man I married 3 hours ago, was the operative who supervised their executions. The chat feed exploded with shock and outrage. Viewer numbers were climbing towards 700,000, and I could see news outlets starting to pick up the story. CNN, BBC, Reuters. They were all beginning to report on the wedding conspiracy stream that was breaking across social media. You want to talk about national security? I continued, standing up from my chair so I could face Blackthorn directly. Let's talk about how your network has been operating outside legal oversight for over a decade. Let's talk about how you've murdered American citizens on American soil without warrants, trials, or any form of due process. You're dealing with classified information that could compromise ongoing operations. I'm dealing with evidence of mass murder covered up by government officials, I shot back. And now that evidence is public knowledge, broadcast to nearly 1 million people in real time. Blackthorn looked at the laptop screen, watching the viewer count climb, and I saw him make a decision. His hand moved toward his jacket, and Uncle Roderick tensed beside me. I wouldn't, Roderick said quietly. Not with this many witnesses, not with this many people watching. But Blackthorn wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for his phone. Director Blackthorn to command, he said, speaking clearly enough for the microphone to pick up his words. We have a code black situation at the Millfield Springs Library. Full exposure, mass media coverage, civilian casualties unavoidable if we proceed with standard containment protocols. The library went dead silent. Even the teenagers with their phones stopped moving. Sir, came a voice through the phone speaker, loud enough for everyone to hear, are you requesting authorization for public cleanup? Negative, Blackthorn said, and I could see the defeat in his shoulders. I'm requesting immediate program shutdown and full cooperation with incoming federal investigations. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Sir, did you say program shutdown? The operation is blown, Command, completely blown. We have nearly 1 million witnesses to classified operations, documented evidence in the hands of civilians, and media outlets already picking up the story. There's no containing this. Uncle Roderick leaned back in his chair, and for the first time all evening, he smiled. 18 years, he said quietly. 18 years I've been trying to expose these people, and all it took was a wedding reception and a live stream. My phone started ringing, not buzzing, actually ringing with call after call from numbers I didn't recognize. News outlets, I realized. Reporters who wanted interviews, statements, exclusive access to the woman whose wedding had just brought down a classified government assassination program. Mrs. Morrison, Blackthorn said, his voice completely different now, tired, defeated, almost human. What do you want? What do I want? I looked at him, this man who had shaped my entire adult life from the shadows, who had ordered my father's death and then spent 18 years making sure I never learned the truth. I want justice. I want trials. I want every person who participated in this network held accountable for what they've done. That's not... I want my real life back, I continued, cutting him off. Not the manufactured existence you created for me, but the chance to make my own choices, form my own relationships, pursue my own path without government handlers monitoring every decision. The people who were placed in your life, many of them genuinely cared about you. Your work at the foundation, your friendships, even your marriage. My marriage, I said, and my voice cracked slightly, was an assignment. My husband was ordered to fall in love with me, and apparently he was very good at following orders. As if summoned by my words, Jasper appeared in the library entrance. He looked different now, smaller somehow, less imposing. The confident military bearing was gone, replaced with something that looked almost like shame. He walked slowly toward our corner, ignoring the stares and whispers from other patrons. When he reached our table, he stopped about 6 feet away, as if he was afraid to get too close. Adrienne, I know you don't want to hear this, but I need you to know what I feel for you, what developed between us, that was real. The assignment was to monitor you, but falling in love with you wasn't part of the plan. But you did it anyway. You fell in love with me while reporting every detail of my life to the people who murdered my father? Yes, and you would have killed me if your orders had changed. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. I don't know, he finally said. I'd like to think I would have refused those orders, but honestly, I don't know.
The brutal honesty of that admission was somehow worse than a lie would have been. I assume your people can expedite the paperwork, I said. Adrienne, don't, I said, holding up a hand to stop him. Just don't. There's nothing you can say that will make this okay. There's no explanation that will justify what you did. What any of you did. I looked around the library, at Uncle Roderick with his laptop still streaming to nearly 1 million viewers, at Director Blackthorne with his phone calls to dismantle a decades-old operation, at Jasper with his orders to love and betray me, at all the innocent bystanders who had become witnesses to the exposure of a government conspiracy. But there is something you can do, I continued, looking directly at Blackthorne. You can cooperate fully with whatever investigations follow this. You can provide complete documentation of every operation, every target, every operative involved in this network. You can help the families of your victims get the truth about what happened to their loved ones. And in exchange? In exchange, I don't spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows exactly what this network did and who was responsible for it. The viewer count hit 1 million people, and notifications were pouring in from news outlets around the world. Hashtag Wedding Conspiracy was trending globally, and the story was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Director Blackthorne looked at the screen, then at me, then at the crowd of library patrons who were documenting every word with their phones. "I'll make the necessary arrangements," he said quietly. And just like that, 18 years of lies began to unravel in a public library on what should have been the happiest day of my life. 2 years later, I stood in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, wearing a simple navy blue suit instead of a wedding dress, my hair pulled back in a professional bun instead of flowing beneath a veil. The hearing room was packed with reporters, family members of victims, and government officials who were about to learn exactly how deep the conspiracy had gone. Ms. Whitmore, Senator Patricia Coleman said, using my maiden name, the name I'd legally reclaimed 6 months after that night in the library, "You've provided this committee with documentation of 47 confirmed eliminations carried out by the network known as Project Nightfall between 2006 and 2023. Can you walk us through how you obtained this evidence?" I leaned forward to the microphone. No longer the naive environmental consultant who'd believed her husband was a logistics coordinator. The woman who spoke to the committee had spent 2 years working with federal investigators, victim advocacy groups, and international human rights organizations to expose every aspect of the assassination network that had controlled her life. "Senator, the evidence came from multiple sources. My father's original investigation files, which my uncle had preserved for 18 years, internal documents provided by Director Blackthorne as part of his cooperation agreement, and testimony from operatives who chose to come forward once the program was exposed, including Jasper, though I didn't say his name aloud. He'd spent the last 2 years in federal custody, providing detailed accounts of every operation he'd supervised, every target he'd eliminated, every order he'd carried out. His cooperation had been instrumental in building cases against the network's leadership, but it hadn't been enough to avoid prosecution for his own crimes. And what was the ultimate scope of this network's operations? Project Nightfall operated in all 50 states and 12 foreign countries. They eliminated journalists, environmental activists, federal prosecutors, judges, scientists, and whistleblowers, anyone who posed a threat to the interests of their sponsors in the defense contracting industry. I clicked to the next slide in my presentation, showing a map dotted with red markers.
Each marker represented a life ended by the network my father had died trying to expose. The total body count, based on documentation we've recovered, is at least 83 confirmed kills over 17 years of operations. A murmur ran through the hearing room. Even though these numbers had been reported in the media for months, seeing them presented in an official government proceeding gave them a different weight. Ms. Whitmore, can you tell us about the Millfield Springs Community Foundation where you were employed for 3 years? The foundation was a front operation designed to keep me occupied with work that felt meaningful while I was under surveillance. However, the environmental projects we funded were real, and they did provide genuine benefits to local communities. The irony is that some of the most important conservation work in our region happened because a government assassination program needed a convincing cover story. That was one of the few things I could say about those 3 years with bitterness. The wetlands restoration project, the community gardens, the renewable energy initiatives, they had made a real difference, even if they'd been built on lies. And your current work? I smiled for the first time during the hearing. I'm the executive director of the Whitmore Foundation for Government Accountability. We provide legal support and resources for families seeking truth about suspicious deaths of activists and journalists. We also offer protection and relocation services for whistleblowers who want to expose government corruption.
The foundation had been my father's idea, in a way. While going through his files, I'd found notes about his plan to create exactly this kind of organization, if he survived his investigation into Project Nightfall. Building it in his memory felt like completing his work, rather than starting my own. You've essentially turned your personal tragedy into a mission to prevent others from experiencing the same loss. That's exactly right, Senator. No family should have to wait 18 years to learn the truth about how their loved one died. No one should live their entire adult life surrounded by handlers pretending to be friends. And no journalist or activist should have to worry that asking the right questions will result in a staged accident. After the hearing, I walked down the Capitol steps into the crisp October afternoon. Uncle Roderick was waiting for me by the fountain, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. Exposing the truth had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he'd been carrying since my father's death. "How do you feel?" he asked as we started walking toward the metro station. "Tired," I admitted, "but good tired, like we've finally finished something important. Your father would be proud of you, Adrienne. The work you're doing, the way you've turned this nightmare into something that helps people, he would be so proud." I thought about my father as we rode the train back to my apartment in Arlington. Not the environmental blogger I'd been told he was, but the investigative journalist who'd risked everything to expose corruption. I kept a photo of him on my desk now, the real him, in his Washington Herald press credentials, taken just months before Project Nightfall decided he was too dangerous to live. The apartment I lived in now was nothing like the fake house in Millbrook Heights that had been part of my surveillance package. This place was small, but it was mine. Really mine. Chosen by me, paid for with money I earned, doing work that mattered. No handlers had helped me pick the neighborhood. No government operatives had influenced my decorating choices. For the first time in my adult life, every decision about my living space had been entirely my own. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, working on my testimony for the next day's hearing, this time about the financial networks that had funded Project Nightfall's operations. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, one of my former bridesmaids. "Saw you on the news today. You looked strong up there. Proud to know you." Rebecca had been one of the few people in my life who hadn't been placed there by the network. Our friendship had been real, which made it one of the relationships I'd been able to salvage from the wreckage of my previous existence. She'd stood by me through the investigations, the media attention, and the slow process of rebuilding my identity from scratch. Not everyone had been so supportive. My mother and I were still working through years of complicated emotions about her role in the deception. She genuinely believed she was protecting me, but 18 years of lies had damaged our relationship in ways that couldn't be fixed with simple apologies. We're trying, though. Meeting for coffee once a month, talking honestly for the first time in decades, slowly learning who we were to each other when we weren't performing roles written by government handlers. My phone rang, interrupting my work. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but after 2 years of being a public figure in a high-profile conspiracy case, I was used to calls from reporters and documentary filmmakers. Adrienne Whitmore speaking? Miss Whitmore, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. We've received some new information about Project Nightfall that we think you should see. My stomach tightened. I'd thought we'd uncovered everything, documented every operation, identified every victim. The idea that there might be more was both exciting and terrifying. What kind of information? A former contractor has come forward with files about international operations. It appears the network was active in 7 additional countries we hadn't identified. The scope is larger than we initially understood. I closed my laptop and reached for my coat. I'll be there in 20 minutes. As I walked to the FBI field office through the quiet Arlington streets, I thought about the question Senator Coleman had asked during the hearing. How did it feel to turn personal tragedy into a mission to help others? The answer was complicated. Some days it felt empowering, like I was honoring my father's memory by finishing the work he had started. Other days it felt overwhelming, like I was drowning in other people's grief and loss. But most days, it felt necessary. Like this was what I was supposed to be doing with whatever years I had left on this earth. The network had stolen 18 years of my life, built on the grave of my father's murder. They'd controlled my education, my career, my friendships, even my marriage. They'd tried to turn me into a perfectly managed asset who would never ask inconvenient questions or threaten their operations. But they made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that learning the truth would break me, would make me retreat into silence and safety. Instead, it had freed me.
For the first time in my life, I was exactly who I chose to be. Not the person they'd shaped me to become, but the woman who'd emerged from the wreckage of their lies. I was my father's daughter in ways that had nothing to do with genetics, and everything to do with the courage to ask dangerous questions and demand uncomfortable answers. The FBI building came into view, and I quickened my pace. There was more work to do, more victims to identify, more families who deserved to know the truth about how their loved ones had died. I'd started my adult life believing I was going to save the environment, one community project at a time. Instead, I'd become someone who saved families from the torture of unanswered questions about government-sponsored murders. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd chosen. And for the first time since that night in the library when my world exploded, that felt like enough. Have you ever had your entire life turned upside down by a truth you never saw coming? Have you ever discovered that the people closest to you weren't who you thought they were? Drop a comment below and share your story, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to stay silent about the lies that shaped us. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. There are more truth-telling stories coming, more exposure of the systems that prefer shadows to light, more proof that ordinary people can bring down extraordinary corruption when they refuse to be silenced. Remember, your truth belongs to you. No one else gets to write your story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.